Are you absolutely certain this young man should be the one taking care of our most important patient? The voice of Dr. Catherine Wellington, sharp and cold as a shard of glass, echoed down the hushed, sterile corridor of the 5th floor of Mount Sinai Hospital. It was a voice accustomed to absolute authority, a voice that could, with a single, condescending phrase, end a career. Every nurse, every orderly, every passing resident within earshot froze, their eyes darting nervously towards the young doctor standing at the entrance to room 312. Dr. Andre Santos stopped. His hand on the doorframe, he took a slow, deep breath, the familiar scent of antiseptic and floor polish filling his lungs. He adjusted the stethoscope around his neck, a small, unconscious gesture of a man bracing for impact. At 27 he was wearingly accustomed to these moments, these public challenges to his competence, his presence, his very right to exist in these hallowed halls. 3 years of residency at one of New York's most prestigious, and predominantly white, hospitals had taught him that his intelligence would always be questioned, his credentials always doubted, his every decision second-guessed. He had learned that for a black man from a public university, competence was not enough. You had to be perfect. And even then, it was rarely sufficient. Dr. Wellington, Andre replied, his voice a calm, quiet island in the sea of her hostility. He had learned through years of painful practice to cultivate this stillness, to build an invisible armor of professionalism against the daily barrage of my. Victoria Blackwood has been under my direct care for the past 2 weeks. In that time, her intracranial pressure has stabilized, and her vital signs have shown significant and measurable improvement. The current treatment protocol is working. The hospital's medical director, a woman whose ambition was as sharp as her designer suits, crossed her arms. Her icy blue eyes studied Andre as if he were a particularly puzzling and unwelcome specimen under a microscope. The Blackwood family, she stated, her voice a low, menacing purr, donated $4 million for the construction of our new pediatric wing. We cannot afford to experiment with the life of their only daughter. Andre knew exactly what she meant by experiment. It was the same coded language he had been hearing his entire life, since arriving at Mount Sinai on a full academic scholarship, a scholarship he had earned by working 3 jobs to put himself through a state university while graduating at the top of his class. Every case he had been assigned, every patient he had treated had felt like a test. It was as if he had to prove, every single day, that he was not a diversity hire, not a charity case, but a doctor who had earned his place through sheer, undeniable merit. Victoria Blackwood, the patient, in room 312, was the ultimate test. She was the heiress to one of the largest real estate fortunes in the country, a 25-year-old blonde princess who had been in a deep, unresponsive coma for the past 4 months, the result of a tragic yachting accident in the Caribbean. She was surrounded by a family that treated the hospital staff like domestic servants. A family whose casual, ingrained prejudice was as much a part of their identity as their immense wealth, and they were particularly dismissive of doctors who didn't look like them. With all due respect, Dr. Wellington, Andre said, his voice remaining impeccably professional, though a quiet, dangerous fire was beginning to burn in his eyes. My training in neurology at Johns Hopkins, and my subsequent specialization in traumatic brain injury and altered states of consciousness, speak for themselves. The mention of Johns Hopkins, one of the most respected medical schools in the world, made Catherine Wellington's perfectly sculpted brow furrow in irritation. It was always like this. The initial, reflexive dismissal based on his appearance, followed by a flicker of genuine surprise when they were confronted with his impeccable credentials, and then, inevitably, a doubling down on the subtle, insidious attempts to diminish his achievements, to undermine his authority. Andre pushed the door open and entered Victoria's room. The morning light, soft and golden, filtered through the expensive custom-made curtains, illuminating a scene of quiet, opulent tragedy. The young heiress lay motionless in the center of the massive, state-of-the-art hospital bed, her breathing a soft, rhythmic hiss from the ventilator. She was surrounded by a forest of expensive, exotic flowers, bouquets that arrived daily from her high society friends. Their vibrant colors, a stark, almost mocking contrast to the pale, still figure in the bed. But Andre saw something that no one else had noticed. He had spent hours in this room, not just performing the routine medical checks, but observing. He had documented, in his private, meticulous notes, the subtle, almost imperceptible neurological signs that the other doctors, the more experienced, more jaded, and more prejudiced doctors, had missed. The small, fluttering movements of her eyelids in response to his voice, The minute, almost undetectable changes in her breathing patterns when he played a piece of classical music, the micro-reactions of her pupils to specific light stimuli. His master's thesis, a groundbreaking work on the subtle markers of consciousness in comatose patients, had given him a knowledge, a perspective, that few doctors in the world possessed. He knew, with a certainty that was growing every single day, that Victoria Blackwood was not as lost as everyone believed. "Good morning, Victoria," Andre murmured, his voice soft, gentle, as he began the delicate process of changing the dressing on the surgical incision on her head. "I know you're in there, and I want you to know that I'm not giving up on you. When you're ready to come back, I'll be here." What Andre couldn't possibly know was that his words were not just a hopeful prayer sent out into the void. They were being heard. Victoria Blackwood had, in fact, been conscious for the past 3 weeks. She was a prisoner in her own body, a ghost in the machine of her own non-responsive flesh. She was trapped in a silent, terrifying abyss, able to hear, to see, to feel, but utterly unable to communicate. She had listened to the endless, hushed conversations of her family, their grief slowly curdling into a kind of impatient frustration. She had heard the dismissive, condescending pronouncements of the senior doctors who had all but written her off as a permanent resident of the vegetative state, and she had heard every single ugly, prejudiced comment directed at the young, quiet, and impossibly kind doctor who was, at this very moment, treating her with more gentle, respectful care than anyone had shown her in her entire, privileged life. For the first time, Victoria Blackwood, the girl who had everything, was learning what it truly meant to be judged, to be dismissed, to be deemed unworthy, of something entirely beyond her control. While Andre worked with a surgeon's precision, checking her reflexes, monitoring the subtle neurological signs that only he seemed to see, Victoria, in the silent, screaming prison of her own mind, struggled. She fought to send a sign, any sign, that she was awake, that she was aware. But her body, a thing that had once responded to her every whim, now seemed disconnected from her will, as if an invisible, impenetrable barrier stood between her consciousness and the physical world. And then, as Andre leaned in close, checking her pupillary reflexes with a small penlight, something extraordinary happened. It was a flicker, a movement so small, so subtle, that anyone else would have missed it. But Andre, who had been waiting for this, hoping for this, saw it: a pattern, a distinct non-random sequence of eye movements, a desperate silent attempt at communication. "Interesting," he muttered to himself, his heart beginning to race. He discreetly jotted down his observations in the small personal notebook he always carried, a notebook filled with the secrets of his patients, the secrets that the official charts never told. It was at that moment that the door to the room burst open, shattering the quiet intimacy of the moment. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice of Margaret Blackwood, the family's formidable matriarch, echoed through the room like a whip. She was an elegant, terrifying woman in her 60s, her face a mask of iron-willed control. She entered the room flanked by her son Richard, a man in his 40s whose arrogance was a poor disguise for his own deep-seated insecurities, and by Dr. Wellington herself, her expression a mixture of indignation and triumphant vindication. Straightened up slowly, deliberately keeping his hands where everyone could see them, a habit he had developed over years of dealing with people who were all too eager to misinterpret the actions of a black man in a position of authority. "I am performing a routine neurological examination, Mrs. Blackwood," he replied, his voice a model of professional calm. "Victoria has been showing some very promising signs that I would like to investigate further." Richard Blackwood, a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted through a combination of his family's money and his own bullying influence, stepped forward. "Signs," he sneered. "Signs that the other doctors, the doctors with far more experience, the doctors we are paying a fortune for, have all failed to detect. How convenient." The irony was almost comical. Andre had published 2 groundbreaking articles on altered states of consciousness in prestigious international medical journals during his residency, an achievement that few doctors, even those at the end of their long and distinguished careers, could claim. But here, in this room, his credentials, his expertise, his very real and measurable contributions to the field of neurology were worth less than the color of his skin. "With all due respect," Andre said, his voice remaining respectful while his eyes held a new, firm resolve that made Margaret Blackwood recoil almost imperceptibly. "My specialization is precisely in cases like Victoria's. The program at Johns Hopkins is #1 in the country in the field of neuro, and my thesis on—" "Enough," Dr. Wellington cut in, her voice sharp and dismissive. "The family has the right to choose who provides care for their daughter. And frankly, Dr. Santos," she looked him up and down, her gaze a slow, insulting appraisal, "perhaps you should focus on patients who are more suited to your level of experience." The veiled insult, the coded language of prejudice, hung in the air between them like a toxic, invisible smoke. Andre knew exactly what she meant by suited: the poor patients. The ones with no insurance, the cases that no one else wanted. Those were the opportunities that people like him, in their view, deserved. But what truly broke Andre's heart, what sent a shard of pure cold rage through him, was the realization that Victoria was hearing all of this. He glanced at her monitors. Her heart rate had spiked, a small but significant change. Imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but crystal clear to someone with his expertise. She was conscious, she was trapped, and she was being forced to listen to every prejudiced, demeaning word directed at the one doctor who had been treating her not as a case, not as a problem, but as a human being. "Very well," Andre said finally, putting away his stethoscope, his face a mask of cool, professional detachment. "I will speak with Dr. Harrison about transferring the case." Dr. Harrison was the hospital's senior neurologist, a man known more for his diplomatic skills with wealthy families than for his current medical competence. "But before I go," he turned and looked directly at Margaret Blackwood, "I would like you to know that your daughter has been showing neurological patterns that are consistent with a gradual, but definite, return of consciousness, signs that other doctors may not be trained to recognize immediately." Margaret frowned. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "I am stating, as my professional medical opinion, that your daughter may be much more conscious than she appears. And if that is the case," he paused, letting the full weight of his words land, "then she has been listening to every single conversation that has taken place in this room for the past 3 weeks." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Margaret stared at her daughter, her expression a complex, unreadable mixture of hope and something that looked a lot like guilt. Is that possible?" Margaret asked, her voice losing some of its previous iron-willed authority. Andre nodded gravely. "It's more common than you might think. Patients in prolonged comatose states sometimes regain consciousness in stages, hearing and processing information long before they are able to respond physically. That's why I always recommend that families talk to their patients as if they were awake." He didn't mention that he had spent the past 2 weeks doing just that, talking to Victoria about medicine, about classical music, about the daily struggles and small victories of his own life. Conversations that now, in this new, terrifying context, made perfect, heartbreaking sense. Dr. Wellington cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Well," she said, "that's all just speculation, Doctor. I'm sure Dr. Harrison will be able to assess the situation properly when he takes over the case." "Dr. Harrison," Andre said, a small, humorless smile touching his lips, "who, interestingly enough, has never published a single paper on neurology, and whose last professional development course on comatose states was 15 years ago. But I'm sure," he added, his voice dripping with a quiet, devastating irony, "that he will take excellent care of Victoria." It was a subtle but brutal criticism, a quiet, professional assassination. As the Blackwoods and Dr. Wellington swept out of the room, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and a new, unwelcome uncertainty. Andre approached Victoria's bed one last time. "If you can hear me," he whispered, his voice too soft for anyone outside the room to hear, "I want you to know that I will never give up on a patient, not because of prejudice, not because of pressure, but more importantly," he leaned in closer, "I want you to know that you are much, much stronger than any of them realize. And when you are ready to come back, I hope you remember that true strength doesn't come from money, or from status, or from power. It comes from how we treat people, especially when they are at their most vulnerable, especially when they cannot defend themselves." What Andre couldn't see, what he couldn't possibly know, was the single, solitary tear that escaped from the corner of Victoria's eye and rolled, hot and silent, down her cheek. It was the first physical, voluntary reaction she had been able to produce in for long months. For the first time in her privileged, pampered, and profoundly empty life, she was experiencing what it meant to be judged, and to be defended, based not on her last name, but on her character. And as Andre gathered his belongings, carefully documenting all of his observations about the case before he passed it on, something extraordinary was happening inside Victoria's mind, inside her body. The combination of the raw, righteous outrage at the injustice she had just witnessed, and the fierce, unexpected hope that Andre's words had inspired in her was creating a neurological storm, a powerful galvanic surge that was beginning to break down the invisible barriers that had held her captive for so long. Every prejudiced word she had heard, every moment of quiet, unshakable dignity Andre had shown under pressure, was forging in her a completely new and completely terrifying understanding of justice, of character, and of the true, hidden value of people. And that new awareness was becoming the key, the one and only key, that could finally, after so long, free her from her silent, lonely prison. But not in the way that anyone, not her family, not her doctors, and not even Andre himself, could ever have predicted. That what the Blackwoods didn't know was that Andre Santos wasn't just another talented, hard-working doctor fighting against a prejudiced system. He was a born strategist, he was a warrior, and he had learned, early on in his life, that in this world, you don't win by shouting, you win by proving yourself. And the proof he was about to build, the case he was about to construct, would be devastating. For 3 days after being unceremoniously removed from Victoria's case, Andre continued to work at the hospital as if nothing had happened. He performed his rounds, he treated his patients, he endured the cold, dismissive glances of Dr. Wellington and the other senior staff with his usual, infuriating calm. But in his spare time, in the quiet, stolen hours of the night, something very different was going on. His small, cramped apartment, a space usually filled with medical textbooks and the scattered toys of a life he rarely had time to live, was transformed into a makeshift command center. He was on a new mission, a mission to save Victoria Blackwood, not just from her medical condition, but from her own family. He meticulously organized every piece of evidence he had collected about her true neurological state, the video clips of her eye movements, the photographs of the monitor readings, showing the subtle, significant spikes in her heart rate during the prejudiced conversations about him, the time-stamped notes detailing her micropupillary reactions to specific stimuli. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Andre?" Dr. James Wilson, his old mentor from Johns Hopkins, asked, his face a mask of concern on the encrypted video. Cole Wilson was more than just a mentor. He was the man who had seen the raw, brilliant potential in a poor kid from the Bronx and had fought to get him the full scholarship that had changed his life. "Absolutely certain," Andre replied, pointing to a series of complex graphs on his screen, the eye movement patterns, the variations in heart rate, the pupillary reactions. "It all indicates that Victoria Blackwood has been in a state of minimal consciousness for at least 3 weeks, possibly longer. She is, for all intents and purposes, aware." "And you've documented all of this?" Wilson asked, his voice grave. "Every detail," Andre confirmed. "Videos, photos, time-stamped notes. I even have records of how her neurological responses change when specific people enter the room." He paused, his expression hardening, including her reactions to the less-than-professional conversations about me. What Andre didn't tell his mentor, what he hadn't yet told anyone, was that he had discovered something even more disturbing. While discreetly, and perhaps not entirely legally, investigating Victoria's previous medical records, he had found a series of alarming inconsistencies in her initial diagnosis. Dr. Harrison, the man who had taken his place, had not only ignored the obvious neurological signs of recovery that Andre had seen, but he had also kept Victoria on a regimen of powerful sedatives, medications that could be artificially prolonging her unconscious state. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the situation was rapidly, dangerously deteriorating for Victoria. Dr. Harrison, true to his reputation for incompetence disguised as diplomacy, had implemented a completely inappropriate treatment protocol, one that was designed more to placate the family than to actually help the patient. Worse, Margaret Blackwood, frustrated by her daughter's lack of progress, had begun pushing for more definitive, more aggressive procedures. Dr. Harrison, Margaret, had said during one of her daily visits, her voice a sharp, impatient command, "Our patience is wearing thin. Victoria has been in this state for months. Perhaps it is time to consider more aggressive options. We have access to the best specialists in the world." Richard, her son, had added, nodding vigorously, "Perhaps an experimental surgery." Harrison, a man far more concerned with keeping the hospital's wealthiest donors happy than with the actual well-being of his patients, had begun to seriously consider these dangerous, reckless options. While he had said, "There are some new invasive procedures that could potentially stimulate brain activity," what none of them realized was that Victoria, still trapped in her silent, terrifying prison, but growing more conscious, more aware with each passing day, was Hearing every single word of this terrifying conversation, for the first time in her life, she was beginning to truly understand the stark, brutal contrast between the genuine, compassionate care that Andre had shown her, and the dangerous, self-serving neglect she was now receiving from her own family, and their hand-picked sycophantic Dr. It was then that Andre decided it was time to act, using his contacts at the university, and the quiet, considerable influence of Dr. Wilson. He began to prepare something that the Blackwoods, in their arrogance, would never see coming. It would not just be a medical exposé, it would be a complete, public, and utterly devastating demolition of the entire corrupt structure of prejudice and incompetence that dominated that hospital. James, Andre had said during one of his late-night conversations with Wilson, "I need you to contact Dr. Patricia Reeves at the State Medical Board, and I also need you to contact the producers of that investigative television program, Medicine in Focus." Wilson had raised his eyebrows. "Andre, are you sure? You want to go that far? The Blackwoods are very powerful. They could destroy your career." Andre had smiled. It was not the gentle, compassionate smile he wore for his patients. This was a different smile. A dangerous smile. "Professor," he had said, "they may try to destroy my career, but I am going to destroy something that is far more important to them. Their reputation." What Andre had discovered in his investigations was even more damning than simple medical incompetence. He had found financial documents, memos from the family's lawyers, that showed that the Blackwoods had been actively pressuring the hospital to keep Victoria in a prolonged, medically induced coma, in order to delay a series of complex legal issues related to her inheritance and her control of a significant portion of the family trust. Margaret, it seemed, was using her own daughter's tragic condition to maintain her own iron-fisted control of the family business. But the centerpiece of Andre's plan was not just to expose the corruption, it was something far more powerful. He had found a way to communicate with Victoria. He had spent his nights researching, developing a system based on the most advanced cutting-edge neurological techniques he had learned at Johns Hopkins. Small, coded sequences of hand pressure, specific, rhythmic patterns of light, a series of simple yes-or-no questions that could be answered with the faintest, almost imperceptible flicker of an eyelid, methods that other, less dedicated, less brilliant doctors didn't even know existed, and Victoria was responding. During his secret late-night visits to the hospital, visits that he was able to make with the help of a few sympathetic nurses, who had also grown to despise the Blackwoods' arrogance, Andre had established a basic but functional line of communication with the young heiress. She was not only conscious, she was furious, and she was desperate to expose what her own family was doing to her. "Victoria," Andre had whispered during one of these clandestine visits, his hand resting gently on hers. "If you can hear me, I am putting something together. A plan. Your family. They are going to try to perform a dangerous, unnecessary surgery on you, but I promise you I will not let that happen." Her response, to almost imperceptible squeezes of his hand, was all the confirmation he needed. Victoria Blackwood, the spoiled, privileged heiress that everyone thought they knew, was ready to fight, and she was ready to fight alongside the one doctor her family had so cruelly, so stupidly, rejected out of pure prejudice. The plan was almost ready. In 72 hours, during the Blackwoods' next scheduled medical meeting with Dr. Harrison, Andre would execute the most devastating, most public, and most satisfying expose that hospital had ever witnessed. And this time, he would not be alone. He would have Victoria's own, silent, but powerful voice to corroborate every single word. As Andre finalized the last details of his strategy, checking every piece of evidence, every recording, every document he had collected, something extraordinary was happening in room 312. Victoria, fueled by the raw, righteous outrage and the fierce, unexpected hope that Andre had planted in her, was gathering her own strength. She was fighting. She was focusing all of her will, all of her energy, on a single, impossible task. She was preparing for a war the enemy didn't even know was coming. Because sometimes, the best, most satisfying revenge doesn't come from the one who was wronged. It comes from the unexpected, and utterly devastating alliance between two people who refuse to accept that prejudice and incompetence can ever be allowed to defeat truth and justice. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on Thursday morning, in the main auditorium of the hospital's new pediatric wing, the very wing the Blackwoods had funded. Dr. Harrison had summoned the family to discuss the aggressive new procedures that Margaret had been so insistent upon. Andre Santos waited outside, in the hallway, officially not allowed to enter. But what the Blackwoods didn't know was that at this point, Andre no longer needed anyone's permission. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Harrison began, his voice filled with a false, oleaginous sincerity. After consulting with a number of renowned specialists, I believe that an experimental deep brain stimulation surgery could significantly speed up Victoria's recovery. Margaret nodded vigorously. Finally, she said, someone with some initiative. How much longer are we going to wait? It was at that exact moment that the auditorium doors swung open. Andre entered, but he was not alone. He was accompanied by 3 people who made Margaret Blackwood's blood run cold. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the formidable head of the State Medical Commission, a cameraman from the National Investigative Television Program, Medicine in Focus, and Dr. James Wilson, whose name was a legend in medical circles around the world. "Excuse the interruption," Andre said, his voice a calm, quiet thunder in the suddenly silent room, "but I believe you are about to make a mistake. A mistake that could cost Victoria Blackwood her life." "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard Blackwood exploded, lunging to his feet. "You were removed from this case. Security." "Actually," Dr. Reeves interjected, flashing her official identification, "Dr. Santos contacted our office with substantial, credible evidence of serious medical negligence and possible criminal malpractice. I have the legal authority to investigate this case immediately." Harrison tried to maintain his composure, but his hands were shaking. "This is ridiculous. What evidence?" Andre smiled. It was not the gentle, compassionate smile he wore. With his patients, this was a different smile. A dangerous smile. "I'll start," he said, "with the recordings." What followed was a systematic, brutal, and beautiful demolition of everything the Blackwoods thought they controlled. Andre had secretly recorded his conversations with Harrison, conversations in which the older doctor admitted he hadn't studied neurology in years. He presented the financial documents, showing the suspicious payments from the family to the hospital, payments that coincided with the decision to keep Victoria on the expensive, life-sustaining equipment. And most devastatingly of all, he presented Victoria's own medical records, proving, with irrefutable, scientific certainty, that she had been showing clear, undeniable signs of returning consciousness for weeks. Signs that Dr. Harrison had either been too incompetent to see, or had been deliberately ignoring. "Impossible," Margaret stammered, her voice no longer the voice of a powerful matriarch, but of a cornered, frightened woman. "Victoria has been in a coma for months." "She was," Andre corrected her, "and during that time, she heard every single one of your prejudiced conversations about me. She heard every discussion about keeping her unconscious for your own financial and legal purposes. She heard every dangerous, reckless plan you made to speed up unnecessary, and potentially fatal, procedures." The final, devastating bombshell came when Andre turned on a large tablet, showing a live feed from room 312. Victoria Blackwood was sitting up in bed. She was fully conscious, and she was calmly, quietly, and with a new, steely resolve in her eyes, chatting with a nurse about the events of the past few months. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. "When did she?" Harrison stammered, his career, his reputation, his entire life, evaporating before his very eyes. "Victoria regained full consciousness 3 days ago," Andre explained, "but she asked us to keep it a secret until this meeting. She wanted to be present, in her own way, when the truth was finally revealed." Dr. Wilson approached Harrison, his face a mask of pure but professional contempt. 30 years of medicine, Harold," he said, his voice a low, disgusted growl. "And you were about to perform an unnecessary craniotomy on a conscious patient. That is not negligence, that is criminal incompetence." Margaret tried one last, desperate gambit. "You can't prove we knew anything about this." Andre opened a second folder, pulling out a series of detailed, transcribed notes. "Actually," he said, "I can." Victoria meticulously documented every single conversation she overheard during her period of silent consciousness, including your discussions about using her condition to maintain your control of the family business. The cameraman captured every moment of the growing horror on the Blackwoods' faces. Richard had turned a ghostly white. Margaret looked as if she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "There's more," Andre continued relentlessly. "The Commission's investigation has revealed a disturbing, systemic pattern of discrimination at this hospital. Competent doctors are being removed from lucrative cases for reasons that have nothing to do with their medical qualifications." Dr. Reeves took the floor, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Dr. Harrison, you are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation by the medical board. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, our financial investigation into your payments to this hospital will be intensified, and as for your familiar..." Donation to the pediatric wing. She paused dramatically. It will be returned, in full, until the serious ethical issues involved in this matter are clarified. It was then that something truly extraordinary happened. Victoria's voice, clear and determined, came through the speaker connected to the tablet. I would like, she said, to make a public statement. Every eye in the room turned to the screen where Victoria was looking directly into the camera, her gaze unwavering. My name is Victoria Blackwood, she began, and for 4 months I was conscious, but unable to communicate. During that time, I witnessed what true medical character looks like when no one is watching. Dr. Andre Santos treated me with more dignity, more competence, and more compassion than any other professional in this hospital. He saved my life, not just medically, but by keeping my humanity intact when others saw me only as a problem to be solved. Margaret tried to interrupt, but Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. My family and Dr. Harrison were about to subject me to an unnecessary and dangerous surgery, because their arrogance, their prejudice, and their greed prevented them from recognizing the obvious signs of my recovery. Dr. Santos was the only one who saw those signs, because he was the only one who cared enough to look. The final blow came when Dr. Reeves announced, as a result of this investigation, and with the full support of the board of directors, Dr. Andre Santos will be promoted to the position of Chief of the Department of Neurology, effective immediately. His groundbreaking research on altered states of consciousness will be fully funded by the university. Margaret and Richard left the auditorium in a stunned, silent disgrace, their reputations in ruins, facing a mountain of financial investigations and the prospect of a lawsuit from their own daughter. Harrison was escorted out by security, his medical license suspended indefinitely. As the cameras captured the final dramatic moments of the meeting, Andre finally allowed himself a moment of genuine, profound satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. Pure, simple, and devastatingly effective. But the real twist was yet to come, because, as Andre would soon discover, Victoria Blackwood wasn't just a patient he had saved. She was about to become the most powerful, most determined, and most unexpected ally he could ever have imagined. And together they were about to launch a revolution. A revolution that would completely transform the corrupt, prejudiced medical system that had done them both so much harm. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's turning them into the unwilling architects of their own irrelevance while you rebuild the world around them in a way they could never, in their wildest, most arrogant dreams, have predicted.